and welcome to my channel. Bonjour et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and today I decided to do an overview of the non-fiction books I've read in 2019. For the simple reason that November is supposed to be dedicated to non-fiction on BookTube, but I hadn't planned to read any non-fiction this November, but I still wanted to participate a little bit somehow, so I decided to do this overview. So without any further delay, let's get into it. At the beginning of this year, I decided to read 3 items in Vintage Classics, Feminist Classics series. These 3, so A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft, The Second Sexe, or Excerpts from the Second Sexe by Simone de Beauvoir, and The Beauty Myth by Naomi. To be fair, they're not complete text, although this one might be, but first of all, I like the format. I like to have several books in a series. I'm shallow like that. And you know, that way it gave me an overview of, well, classics in feminist theory. Because while feminism is a subject near and dear to my heart, I'm very lazy when it comes to reading the original theory of it, especially more academic texts. It's just not really my jam. So, first I read this one, A Vindication of the Rights of Women by Mary Wollstonecraft. One of these seminal feminist texts, I think you could say. I'm not going to go into too much details. I mean, this is an overview. They're not really separate reviews, but I do want to give quick thoughts about all of the books I'm going to mention. I liked it. I respect it for what it was at the time it was published. It's an important text for a reason in the history of feminism. She does make a good case, well, for the equality of men and women, though let's all remember this was written at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, and so there are a lot of elements that we would take for granted today as modern contemporary feminists that are absent of this. I think she does a very good job of explaining the importance of considering men and women's intellectual capabilities on the same footing. She also makes appeals to the spiritual status of men and women, so she does make appeals to good Christian folks of the time, respectable people, and so that also means there's nothing about sexuality in this. But to be fair, she doesn't excuse men's sexual behavior. In fact, she critiques it quite harshly, but it does give off the impression that human beings are supposed to be, you know, virtuous and pure, which I do believe contradicts her own personal life a bit, because I think she had quite a libertine life for the time. But as an introduction and as an OG feminist manifesto, if you will, I mean, it's good. Just if you read this, remember, place it in its proper historical context. It'll make it a lot easier, I think. Afterwards, I read this, The Second Sexe. Now, I broke one of my sacred reading rules, which is never ever read a book in one of your native languages in the other native language. But in my defense, Le Deuxième Sexe de Simone de Beauvoir is like 700 pages long. A lot of it is autobiographical. And then I saw that Vintage Classics had come out with this. I mean, to be fair, it's an excerpt. Basically, there's the conclusion and a chapter, but for what it is, it's really good though. I mean, it does give you a solid taste of Simone de Beauvoir's main thesis, and I love this. Honestly, this was my favorite of the 3. I was like, yes, this is my kind of feminism. I mean, she touches upon everything. You know, the essential difference between humans, which is sex, and the construction of gender upon that. You know, you're not born a woman, you become one, right? Because you're raised to fit into a mold of what a woman is supposed to be, and how that affects everything in society and the arts and literature and relationships, and how that formats women's psyche, you know, constraining them and shackling them to a very limited kind of life. I'm really simplifying to the extreme, but this touched all the right notes, basically, and she does talk about sexuality as well. And finally, I read this, Naomi Wolf's The Beauty Myth. This is a lot more recent. I think this was written in the 80s, or maybe early 90s, so right around the time I was born. It was quite good as well. I enjoyed this, though major qualm. Again, this might actually just be an excerpt, so maybe in the full text there is one, but the lack of bibliography and the lack of sources, because she does cite a lot of numbers in regards with eating disorders or, I guess, mental health issues related to obsession with beauty and the beauty industries, and she just spouts off a lot of numbers. And some of those numbers are quite, I mean, if they're true, they're really worrying. I could believe they are true, but like there aren't any sources at all. I can't check any of the data she cites. I guess it's also the fact that my type of feminism, I am very, very critical of, well, the beauty industry proper and things like mandatory shaving and makeup and stuff. I'm of the opinion that a lot of it is very harmful. I take a very structural analysis to it, and I'm not really about, you know, anything you choose to do is feminist. I don't actually believe that. On the other hand, I'm not a purist either. I think some women can wear makeup because they enjoy the aesthetics of it. I don't think the two positions are mutually exclusive, if you will. I don't think it has to be black and white like that. It's a lot of shades of grey, basically. For myself, I don't wear makeup. I've never liked it, so that's that. But even then, I can recognize that some women do genuinely enjoy doing that for their own personal pleasure. I think it really just becomes a problem when it screws up your mental health and you feel you have to wear makeup to be a woman or to be presentable, to be acceptable to society. That's very toxic. It's a solid read, but like I said, lack of sources, pretty grand claims about some things, and big numbers are mentioned, and I'm like, yeah, well, I would like to check that, especially perhaps to compare it to current data. But again, like I said, maybe if you buy like the regular version of this, maybe there is a lot of sources in an appendix at the end, so I can't say either way. So ranking-wise, definitely the second Sexe first, Beauty Myth second, and A Vindication of the Rights of Women third. But overall, I would strongly recommend these little editions. If nothing else, it's a good introduction to those texts. Might make you want to read the full versions. Then I read what is probably my favourite non-fiction book of 2019. This, The Chalice and the Blade by Riane Eisler. I'm not sure if that's how you pronounce it, but that's what I'm going with. It came out in the late 80s, and I love this. This is about, well, patriarchy and the evolution of society and sexism and misogyny. It goes back to the roots of civilization. It analyzes mythology, religion, archaeological, anthropological data. I mean, it's a mix of several things. It kind of reminded me a bit of Merlin Stone's When God Was a Woman, also an excellent book. I highly recommend it. This is basically a hypothesis of how patriarchal society came about, especially in the West, though that's the focus of the book, but you could apply some of the reasoning to other regions of the world. Another aspect of the book is to tell you that patriarchy is not inevitable. It's not mandated by God or evolution or nature, because it goes to the time before patriarchy existed. Her thesis is that human beings started out as not matriarchal, but egalitarian / matrifocal, mostly. I mean, you can never universalize such things because ultimately we'll never know, but she's not the only one who's had this thesis, to be fair. And she tries to, justify this by looking at, like I said, mythology, old religions, archaeological data, especially around the Fertile Crescent and the Mediterranean basin and what is called the civilization of old Europe. Tries to explain that, you know, the first humans, or at least the humans of 10,000 years ago, no, even more recent than that, you know, like the Minoans and some civilizations of old Europe, weren't warmongering, misogynistic peoples, you know, they were mostly egalitarian farmers. I mean, this is pre-capitalism, obviously, it's pre-hoarding of resources, and then, you know, goes through the archaeological record and the mythological record to try and show the shift in societal structure. I was already a bit familiar with that subject because I've read a lot of books about feminist reinterpretation of mythology and examining shifts in religious systems. And then she offers up great new vocabulary. Because, for example, she says that currently we aren't quite living under a patriarchy, because the problem with the word patriarchy is that it's associated with a specific type of male-dominated society. The word pater means father. It's an old kind of male domination. Today, with capitalism in the mix, it's not just, you know, old men or fathers, it's men in general. And of course you have other axes of oppression, so I'm not going to go to that. So she prefers the term androcracy, which simply means power to men. And I like that, and I've decided to adopt that word actually, but I still use patriarchy because that's what most people are familiar with. It wasn't perfect by any means. For example, from the archaeological record, when she looks at goddesses and things like that, and, all the societies, I'm like, yeah, but what about societies where they have female warriors? Because she does try and give an image that egalitarian societies were extremely peaceful. I think they were extremely peaceful, but you do have non-patriarchal societies that have warriors and female warriors, and, all the warrior goddesses who predate patriarchal societies. I mean, it's very nitpicky, and it's probable that most people wouldn't even care, but that little piece of the puzzle didn't quite fit in with the rest. But otherwise, ultimately it's an essay. You can't really prove any of this, right? This isn't scientific. This is social sciences. It's the humanities, but it's a solid thesis. I'm convinced, let's just put it that way. And in any case, it makes you think. And that's always a good thing. So I highly recommend this book. And then a book in French. I'm not going to switch to French because I think that would be a bit weird. So this is Ma vie sexuelle est plus grosse que la tienne, which translated means My Sexual Life is Bigger Than Yours, by author Maïa Mazaurette. She is a journalist, I believe, and she kind of specializes in the subject of human sexuality, human sexual behaviors and trends. And this is a book about statistics and data regarding people's sexual lives and sexual habits, and the aim is to reassure people, to rid them of their worries and their obsessions with, am I normal? Am I good enough? It's to just, bring it all back into perspective with cold, hard numbers. And overall, it was pretty good. I think it could have been better, obviously. I guess I was looking perhaps for additional data in maybe unusual sexual habits or relationship styles. But overall, it's a solid coverage of, contemporary human sexual behavior. I mean, there's a section about anatomical data, then you have statistics about sexual habits. How many times does the average couple have sex? What kind of positions do they favor? The age at which people have sex for the first time. There's data concerning porn searches. Some of it was actually quite surprising. Relationships also, statistics about relationships, number of partners in a life, how many people get married, how many people stay in committed monogamous relationships, statistics about sexual orientation. So yeah, just solid overview of the available data. In spring, I read 2 books about anarchism. Now, it's an ongoing struggle I have to find a book about anarchism and anarchist theory that is going to click with me. Because in theory, there's a lot of things about anarchism or, left-wing libertarianism, whichever way you want to call it, that appeals to me. But then in practice, I always find myself incredibly annoyed and frustrated because I'm like, yes, but how do you do it? How do you get there? It's all well and good to have these ideals, but how do you implement the theory? Last year, I read some text excerpts by, the big founders, Proudhon, Kropotkin, Bakunin. And so I decided, I'm going to try the feminist anarchist thinker, Emma Goldman. I had such high hopes, and I have nothing to show you because I got rid of it. I tried Anarchism and Other Essays by Emma Goldman, and boy, was I pissed and annoyed. There were a couple of essays I liked, especially her one about the masses and minorities and masses. Like, she actually critiqued hard the concept of the mass. Like, she said, the masses aren't good. The masses tend to foster ignorance and violence, and that's bad. We should foster the emergence of a multitude of brilliant individuals. And I was like, oh yeah, I vibe with that 3000%. And that was it. The rest was like, okay, the general ideas were good, but again, how do you implement that? And some anarchist givens, like the state is evil, you need to explain that to me a bit more. First of all, you need to define the state clearly, and then you need to explain to me, prove to me, have a good solid argumentation as to why the state is irredeemably evil and you must never have a state ever again. I could sort of grasp the general idea, but I need something a bit more concrete. And then I found her extremely bloody condescending at times, like activist smugness, I want to call it, self-righteousness and moral superiority that I really hate in anyone of any political affiliation. I hate that. It annoys the crap out of me. And the other thing that bugged me was I felt the feminism played second fiddle. It wasn't that feminist. I was like, dude, you're an anarchist first, feminist second. Actually, you know what? It reminded me of, like, I've seen this word, you know, like there's brochurist, and then there's manarchist. To me, she sounded like a woman manarchist, if that makes sense. On the other hand, I learned a few things about American history I didn't know about, like the Haymarket riots. Never heard of that, and didn't realize there was actually a quite vivid anarchist movement in the United States at the beginning of the 20th century, so I learned something there, and that's always a good thing. But I swear to you, I threw that book across the floor at one point. I was just so bloody pissed. But I finished it, because I don't like DNFing books, and I finished it. And it wasn't that big, so I was like, dude, just finish it. Speed read it, just finish it. And I did, but so I didn't even keep it. I chucked it away. And then, because I guess I'm masochistic in that regard, I tried this! Again, had high hopes, because I'd read another book in this series about feminism, and it was pretty good, though very British in its focus. And again, disappointed. Less annoyed and pissed, but very disappointed. Very little concrete information about what anarchist thinkers believe are the steps that should be taken to get from A to Z. Like, not even a little C step, a D, an M. No, it's supposed to be magically go from A to Z. So very, very disappointed. Then in the summer, I read another book about feminism that was very prevalent this year. The Periodic Table of Feminism. I like books that offer a synthesis or overview of a topic. And I thought, you know what, this could be a good overview of major feminist figures. And yes, it was. To be fair, each entry is pretty short. They give you the name of a feminist and a blurb about them. So it's pretty basic. I mean, it serves as an introduction more than anything else. But it's a solid selection. I mean, major players of all the feminist waves, as they are called. You've got, of course, Mary Wollstonecraft, Emma Goldman. Of course, you've got Simone de Beauvoir, you've got Emmeline Pankhurst, and of course, in the second wave, you've got Andrea Dworkin, you've got Germaine Greer, you have Gloria Steinem, you've got Bell Hooks, then, yeah, okay, that's the weaker point of the book, the fourth wave. I felt there were unjustified entries, shall we say, a lot of pop feminism and women who, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be mean or to belittle the good they might do, but I really don't think they've, at least as of yet, deserved the status of a feminist icon or a feminist thinker in, the history of the movement, such as Emma Watson or Beyonce. I mean, come on, really? She's not a feminist icon, okay? She doesn't deserve to be in a book alongside Mary Wollstonecraft or Simone de Beauvoir or Bell Hooks. No. The fourth wave is still in flux and still taking shape in a way, so that was clearly the weaker aspect of the book. And finally, sort of, I read this, another French book that I'm going to talk about in English. L'adolescence n'existe pas. Adolescence doesn't exist is the translation. I was really looking forward to reading this book because I have a thing about the concept of adolescence and the way it's being, let's say, twisted out of all meaning and shape by a lot of modern society. And so this was supposed to be about how adolescence is a social construct, a relatively recent one as well. It purported to look at what exactly is adolescence on a biological and social level. How have different peoples and civilizations dealt with the transition period between childhood and adulthood? Some societies not even having it in any meaningful way. And then more of a historical walkthrough in the West to show you how it's evolved throughout the centuries. The main thesis is that basically society has shifted the age at which you become an adult to suit its purposes. Simple as that. Nothing to do with science. For example, in ancient Rome, a man didn't become a fully adult until the age of 25. But they had lots of different divisions of age because they had to learn a lot of different things. But conveniently, guess what? Girls became women as soon as they could have babies. That simple. Because it suited them. And you were a child, and then, let's say around the ages of 15, you gave away your toys and dolls in this ritual ceremony, and then you were married and shipped off to your husband's home. And that was the end of it. And then in the Middle Ages, you had to accommodate population needs in in periods of high population density, the age of marriage, and thus the age of adulthood, because it was really strongly tied into the age at which you left your parents' home, married, and had your own family, you got married at 25. That's a common misconception that basically the Middle Ages, it was just people getting married off when they were 13. Now, there were periods where you were married off very young, but that wasn't all the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. I mean, we're all talking about 400-500 years of history, so it changed quite a bit during that time. At sometimes in the Middle Ages, you weren't married before you were 25. That was completely normal because there were too many people for the time. I mean, they'd be horrified to see how many we are currently today on Earth. At the time, they thought, no, we can't keep up with the food production, so you people should not breed. You should stay abstinent until you get married as late as possible. And then guess what? You had the bubonic plague, which wiped out, a quarter of the European population, and we needed babies! We need babies, we need workers, we need to produce food, so go ahead, get married at 14 and have those kids! And you wouldn't adopt them. So, it's basically a question of convenience. There's no universal metric of when you become an adult. Like I said, they also talk about other societies where most have rites of passage. In some cultures, it's just a ceremony that lasts a day or a week or a month, and then you're a child, and then you're an adult. In other societies, there are different stages. You're a child, and then you're phase 1 teenager, then phase 2 teenager, then phase 1 adult, then phase 2 adult, and then you're a complete member of society, and you can get married and have your own household. Lots of variety in human culture. So adolescence is not a natural phenomenon. It's a cultural construct. Puberty is the biological constant and measure in humans and in all mammals, basically. In nature, you're an adult, more or less, once you can have babies. In humans, well, we have very complex societal structures, and we got freakishly big heads and brains that need a bit longer to mature. So the end of puberty isn't the most adequate marker of adulthood because, if you finish puberty at 15, I don't think a lot of people would, although it has happened that you were an adult at 15 throughout human history. Today, that's just not the case. But then now there's research that says, the brain doesn't finish its structural growth until you're 25, so you're an adolescent until then. You're not an adult before you're 25. I'm like, yeah, but why? Why does that make you an adult? You could argue the brain is the most plastic organ we have. It keeps changing throughout our lives. Some people are very immature at 30, some people are very mature at 16. I don't think that's necessarily the greatest or the most objective measure of adulthood either. It's just another metric we've decided to pick because we find it convenient for whatever reason. Because that's my gripe with that whole discourse. But unfortunately, while the core thesis or core premise was promising, this book was a mess to read. It was just, the structure was all over the place. The references were not clear at all. There was a lot of repetition. I don't know, it felt very messy and disorganized. And that was really a huge letdown. It does heavily criticize the concept of adolescence and teenagehood, especially in later years. This isn't exactly a recent book. It's 20 to 30 years old by now, but even then they were saying, now it's becoming a bit ridiculous. We're preventing people from maturing and joining adult society, and I kind of agree with that premise. But I mean, the argumentation wasn't very strong, and it was just so messy to read. I got annoyed, and I got even a bit bored, and I was expecting something on a different level. So yeah, really disappointing, and in fact, I'm not keeping this book, I'm unhauling it, so that should tell you something. And technically speaking, I'm not going to take it out because it's shelved, and I've already mentioned it in another video, I think in a 2019 reading overview. I read The Mythology book by DK Publishing House. They have a whole collection of such books. I mean, it's a reference book essentially about world mythology. It was decent, pretty good. Lovely, beautiful layout, full color, lots of illustrations and graphs to explain certain concepts in mythology. Unfortunately, it spent way too many pages on Greek mythology and then Roman mythology. Don't get me wrong, it's called classical mythology for a reason, sure, and I mean, fair enough. But the book is marketed as being about world mythology, not Greco-Roman mythology. As such, I don't think they did a good enough job. I mean, the section about the Americas needed to be much bigger, section about Africa as well, section about Asia was decent enough, but even then, I mean, they mush in Chinese, Indian, Japanese. I mean, they're extremely rich traditions. I don't know. I've read actually better, honestly. It's not the best reference book I have on mythology, but it's still decent. So yeah, but that was a bit disappointing though. And that wraps it up. Those were all the non-graphic non-fiction books I've read this year. I hope you enjoyed this little overview, my little bit of participation in non-fiction November. I hope you all have a lovely day or evening. Bye-bye.